All murders are horrifying, but some are so barbaric that they can be hard to think about, let alone talk about. The case of Missy and Michael MacIvor is one such case. As a tropical storm struck the Florida Keys, Missy and Michael were brutally killed in their own home. Missy was 9 months pregnant at the time, a detail that made this case personal not just for the detectives who tried to find the culprit, but to the entire state of Florida. Today we're going to unpack the bizarre murders of the MacIvor family, a family that was extinguished just when it was about to begin. Susan Michelle Immel, who preferred to go by Missy, was born on the 24th of July, 1962, in Titusville, Pennsylvania. From the very start, she was the sort of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. With a smile so warm it could melt butter and a sweet, caring personality to match, pretty much everyone that met Susan instantly took a liking to her. She had a deep love for children, something that she channeled into a career for herself as an elementary school teacher. It was a job she'd wanted all her life, and one that she worked extremely hard to get. Over in Cincinnati, Ohio, her future husband, Michael MacIvor, was born on the 15th of April, 1961. Both his mother and father were obsessed with a miraculous invention, one that was still relatively new at the time: the airplane. His mother received her pilot's license when she was just 16 years old, and she later worked as a flight attendant while his father worked as an airline captain. Airplanes weren't just a way to earn money for the MacIvors. They loved everything about them, with plenty of childhood pictures showing Michael taking airplanes apart and putting them back together again with his family. Just like Susan, Michael carried his childhood passion all the way through to his professional career. He first flew a plane at just 13 years old, and by 17, he knew how to rebuild engines all by himself. He eventually became a professional pilot and certified flight engineer, and eventually started Tamiami Aircraft Accessories in Dade County, Florida. By the time he was in his late 20s, Michael was a successful business owner. All that was left now was to find someone to settle down with, and in 1987, he ran into a girl called Missy that he fell head over heels for practically the moment he saw her. They first locked eyes at a nightclub in 1987 and apparently couldn't stop talking all night. They felt like soulmates from the moment they met, so going steady seemed like the obvious choice to make. 2 years into their relationship, Michael and Missy moved into a private airport community called Tavern Arrow in Key Largo, buying a beautiful house with more than enough space for the 5 children they planned to have. In May of 1990, they got married in their own backyard in a small ceremony full of love. Everyone that saw them had to admit that they were the perfect couple. Michael was tall, strong, and successful, and Missy was beautiful, nurturing, and kind. They were both good people who likely would have been excellent parents. In January of 1991, Michael and Missy took their first step towards parenthood when Missy found out she was pregnant. The next 9 months were probably challenging, but immensely rewarding at the same time. They started to cover the guest room into a nursery and took joy in planning out every little thing for the first new addition to their family. The tragic thing is, they'd never get to use that nursery. In fact, they'd never even get to see the baby boy that was growing in Missy's womb. There was a monster loose in Florida, a monster that would extinguish the MacIvors in a manner so cruel and so inhuman that it's unthinkable. And as it so happens, this monster waited until a literal storm crashed into the Florida Keys before making his move. It was a dark and stormy night. So many stories begin with this term, so much so that it's become a tongue-in-cheek parody of itself. In the case of the MacIvorsons, it spelled the final chapter of their story rather than the first. The tropical storm hit the area in late August, bringing lashing rains and gale-force winds that brought the entire community to a standstill. Michael and Missy had spent the day excitedly preparing for parenthood by attending a Lamaze class together. Michael and Missy were the sort of people that wanted to do things right and work hard to make that happen. They'd already decided to name their child Kyle Patrick MacIvor, and they wanted to make sure that Missy could deliver him naturally. Shortly after the class finished, the sky turned gray with storm clouds. Lightning flashed in the distance. Just like other residents of the area, Michael and Missy hunkered down and waited for the storm to pass. It wasn't a hurricane, but it was close enough to it that going outside was far too risky. And yet, a demon of sorts managed to weather the high-speed winds, fueled by bloodlust and rage, making its way towards the MacIvor home. That LeMay's class would be the last time anyone saw Missy and Michael alive. The storm arrived on the night of August the 21st and left a warm, muggy morning in its wake. The previous night had been rough, but life could now resume as normal. Children started walking into classrooms at Key Largo Elementary, and the teachers likely talked about the insane storm that had just passed. However, one face was curiously absent. Missy, possibly the most dedicated teacher at the school, someone who only took sick days when she absolutely had to, hadn't shown up for work that day. This was highly unusual. On the rare occasion that she took a day off, she'd always phone in beforehand because she took her job seriously and wanted to make sure that her students didn't worry. Missy's absence wasn't just curious, it was straight up alarming. So much so that her colleagues got in touch with Michael's sister Sharon to ask about her. Sharon called the MacIvor house once. No response. She called again. They never picked up. The strange thing was, even their answering machine didn't seem to be working. Sharon told Missy's colleagues that she hadn't been able to get in touch with her, prompting two of them to give the MacIvor residence a visit. The doors were locked, and the curtains were all drawn. All except for one, that is. This curtain was only partly drawn, providing the colleagues with a slim view of the living room. When they peered through, the last thing they expected was to see a person lying deathly still on the floor. Or rather, only the person's feet were visible, and they were possibly at an awkward angle that clearly indicated that they weren't conscious. The MacIvors were beloved in their community, so when their neighbor Bill saw that something seemed to be happening at their house, he came over. It's likely that the colleagues were in a state of distress after seeing something so alarming through the window. Everyone outside the house knew something was wrong, and within moments Bill was breaking the door down. No home is ever truly silent. There's always the sound of someone talking, walking, or even breathing. If nothing else, people use appliances, click-clack away on keyboards, or do something that adds depth to the home's aural tapestry. When Missy's two colleagues and neighbor Bill entered the MacIvor residence, there must have been a silence that was downright unnerving. It was an alien sensation, one that suggested life had abandoned this home, leaving behind only the stillness of death. That's when they saw Michael sprawled on his back on the floor, arms and legs extended, with masking tape wrapped around his head and covering his mouth. The macabre sight also had the bizarre addition of a white sock secured in front of each of Michael's eyes. The police were immediately called, and Detective Jerry Powell soon arrived on the scene to conduct an initial walkthrough. As he searched through the home, he noticed a shoe print on Michael's throat and a metal bar wrapped in a towel in the kitchen. He surmised that the bar was the murder weapon, and that the killer likely stomped on Michael's throat before ending his life. Detective Powell headed to the master bedroom, and this is where the story gets truly disturbing, so we need to provide a trigger warning for what comes next. In the master bedroom lay Missy's naked corpse. Her wrists had been tied to her ankles with what seemed like a clothesline, and a necktie had been wrapped tightly around her neck. 2 pieces of tape covered her eyes, while her nightshirt had been violently torn off of her, and her panties had been snipped off by a sharp instrument of some sort. Missy had been sexually assaulted by the perpetrator while pregnant, after which she'd been strangled to death. Detective Powell may have looked at this horrific scene and wondered what kind of evil creature could do such a thing. It would take him years to find the answer to that question. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. In the following months, the residents of Tavernero started installing alarm systems and buying guns, fearing that they might be the next victims. All the while, police tried to piece together what might have happened. Detective Powell could tell that the murder was premeditated yet improvised. The killer had cut the phone lines and climbed into the nursery via a ladder left there by a contractor. The fact that he struck during the storm was no coincidence, since it allowed him to enter and exit the house unnoticed by anyone else. And yet, the killer didn't bring anything with him other than the metal bar. The material used to bind his victims had been scavenged from the house, though as we'll soon find out, this indicated the killer's experience rather than a lack thereof. He knew that he'd find everything he needed inside the house because he'd done this before and gotten away with it. But the police had no way of knowing that just yet. They collected DNA samples from the crime scene, including samples of the semen found on multiple parts of Missy's body, and a medical examination revealed that both her and Michael had died by strangulation. Michael had been struck by the metal bar, but deep abdominal bruising indicated that he'd also been kicked in the stomach, and his throat had been severely damaged when stomped. One thing this analysis revealed was that the killer knew what he was doing. Michael had been subdued and killed in a very short time span. The same couldn't be said for Missy, however. Medical examiners found ligature marks on her neck, indicating that she'd struggled for some time, forcing the killer to reattempt his strangulation multiple times before he was able to kill her. As for Kyle, the baby she'd been waiting for, he died about 30 minutes after his mother, when the womb became deprived of oxygen. The attack appeared deeply personal, with Missy clearly being the primary target. The nature of the assault carried an undertone of deliberate humiliation. This meant that the attacker likely knew Missy, so police started interrogating people in their social circle. 3 potential suspects were ruled out after they voluntarily provided DNA evidence, one of whom was Missy's ex-husband. And then, police noticed that some of Michael's business dealings didn't seem entirely above board. Michael MacIvor was as honest in business as he was in his personal life, or so it seemed at the very least. And yet police found out that he'd made several trips to Belize, a well-known hub of narcotics production, at a time when the illegal substance trade was at a historic high in Miami. The official reason for these trips was to purchase a plane, and Michael apparently borrowed $17,000 from his brother for it. However, when police looked into it further, they found out that the plane actually cost twice as much. It's unclear where Michael got the rest of the cash from, or indeed why he was trying to buy a plane from Belize in the first place. It turned out that Michael's father suspected that he'd gotten involved in something illegal. He told Michael's brother Jim as much, but he still trusted Michael enough to loan him the sum for the plane. In light of all this, Detective Powell headed to Belize. When he questioned locals about Michael, he heard only the best of things. It seemed that Michael was well-liked no matter where he went in the world. However, during a meeting with the president of Belize, Detective Powell found out that this particular plane had been used for drug smuggling for years. Later on, a man brought in on drug smuggling charges claimed that 2 Colombian brothers that were part of a notorious gang had tortured and killed the MacIvors to send a message. This claim was quickly debunked, though. The smuggler was simply trying to escape his own charges. In the end, nothing really came of the investigation into Michael's business dealings. He bought a plan that had been used for drug smuggling, but there's a chance he just thought it was a good deal. There was no evidence that Michael was involved in anything actually illegal, let alone that he was bringing narcotics into the country. The fact that police chased this lead at all shows how desperate they were getting. None of their strategies were working, and months were slowly turning into years. And then, out of the blue, they made a break in the case. Famed FBI profiler Dale Hinman was called in, and she used the evidence to construct a detailed psychological profile of the killer. She theorized that the killer had a criminal past, that he was familiar with at least some part of Missy's routine, and that he may have been obsessed with Missy. This proved to be the turning point. You see, there was a detective on the force who'd been trying to apprehend a particular suspect for years. The suspect's name was Thomas Overton, and the detective suspected that he was responsible for the assault and murder of 20-year-old Rochelle Surratt. Overton had been working at a movie theater where Rochelle was last seen. She was later found wrapped in a tarp with popcorn kernels near her body. The detective suspected Overton, but there was no evidence directly linking him to the scene. He was named a prime suspect in Missy and Michael's murder in April 1993, and over the next 3 years, police engaged in a seemingly endless game of cat and mouse with him. Not long after Overton was named prime suspect, he allegedly left a threatening note on a woman's mirror, telling her to get a dog and that he planned to kill her. He'd also ripped the head off a stuffed parrot and placed it next to her pillow. But yet again, there was no direct evidence that he was the culprit. Time and time again, Overton came within an inch of being apprehended, only to get away. On another occasion, he was caught trespassing with burglary tools in his possession, but trespassing isn't a felony, and simply possessing tools that can be used in a burglary wasn't enough to bring him in. But police knew one thing: he liked to commit crimes during storms. That was his entire MO. This helped them narrow down when he would attempt another burglary, and they also received a tip from an acquaintance of his about something he was planning. Finally, on October 6, 1996, Overton was caught committing a burglary while armed. Overton was in prison, but he still hadn't been tied to the MacIvor murders. He ended up being the cause of his own downfall on that one. After injuring himself during prison transport in a failed attempt to escape, Overton required gauze from paramedics. Police took the DNA evidence from this gauze and compared it to what they found at MacIvor residence. It was a perfect match. Not long after, Overton confessed to the crime. He'd worked at a gas station Missy frequently visited and at one point tried to flirt with her. Missy told people she knew about the incident and how much it creeped her out. It was especially disturbing behavior considering that Missy was at least 8 months pregnant at the time, and to make things worse, this wasn't a one-off incident. The night before her death, Missy told Michael's sister, Sharon, that Overton had made advances towards her again, and more aggressively this time. What she didn't know was that the culprit had seen her address on a check she wrote and had been stalking her for at least the past several days and potentially several weeks. Overton would regularly go to the MacIvor residence to spy on Missy, a clear sign of his perverse obsession with her. He noticed that there were contractors coming in and out of the home, since the MacIvors were getting Kyle's nursery built. When the storm struck on August 21st, Overton wore a mask, black military-style fatigues, and gloves, and headed for the MacIvor residence. He climbed up the ladder that led to the nursery, slid open the glass door, and quietly entered. Michael was in the kitchen at the time, and he potentially didn't notice Overton sneaking up behind him. The next thing he felt was the pipe slamming into his head, and Michael's immediate reflex was to try and subdue his attacker. A struggle ensued, and Overton eventually knocked Michael out and choked him to death. At some point during this assault, Missy walked in. She saw what was happening, screamed, and ran back to her bedroom. MacIvor followed her, and in his confession, claimed that she begged for her life and tried to tell him she was pregnant. Those words meant nothing to him. MacIvor then fulfilled the vile purpose he'd gone there for, killed Missy, and ripped pages out of an address book to mislead the police. This was partly why police chased down so many bad leads at the start of the investigation. It bought him 5 years of freedom, but now that freedom was over. Overton's trial on October 17, 1998. Prosecutors revealed new evidence, such as photographs of Missy's pregnancy bump that Overton had taken after killing her. Overton had also somehow gotten his hands on autopsy photos, which he showed to an inmate and laughed when it made him vomit. Even a hardened criminal couldn't stomach the things Overton did, and that too with such pride. When the inmate vomited, all Overton had to say was that he'd better not get the picture wet. In the mind of a psychopath, the evidence of his crimes was a trophy. During the trial, Overton gestured and smiled at Missy and Michael's family as they sat in the audience. To the very end, his evil, ruthless demeanor didn't crack once. He seemed to enjoy the attention, somehow making himself out to be the victor even as his guilt was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. On March 18, 1999, Overton was sentenced to death for the murders of Michael and Missy MacIvor. He currently sits on death row awaiting his sentence and has reportedly shown zero remorse for his actions to this day. Michael's parents died not long after he did. They seemed unable to live after the shocking loss. Michael's sister Sharon may have summed it up best when she called Overton the physical form of Satan, a description that perhaps doesn't fully capture how evil he truly is. So what do you think of this case? Was justice served? Or should Thomas Overton have been captured years earlier? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.